Well, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kevin Connors. I'm the Managing Director at the Susan Crown Exchange, and we're a grant-making foundation with the mission to prepare young people to thrive in a rapidly changing world. And we believe deeply in the power of sports and coaching to meet that mission. As a former athlete and high school coach myself and a current youth sports coach, I feel personally tied to the conversation we're about to have. And I know that many in the audience are bringing similar hats today as well. Today, we're beginning a three-part webinar series that will examine the history, current landscape, and possibilities of youth sports policy. As many of us watched in the Winter Olympics, Norway won the medal count, leaving many American observers and pundits to wonder if Norway's highly regulated model of youth sports is something the U.S. should try. As the only country without a centralized governance model for youth sports, the U.S. is an outlier in its reliance on a primarily market-driven sector. There are growing concerns, as many of us know, and those concerns are likely bringing us to this conversation today. We have rising costs, overuse injuries and burnout, limited access for millions of young people who want to join and play. And these have raised questions about whether state and federal regulations might be necessary to rein in the market, support access and quality, and bolster health and safety. The goal of this series is to deepen the conversation, learn from other sectors about the path to state policies, and center the needs, particularly around health, of young people in a discussion that's focused on policy reform in youth sports. This series is also built on the heels of the Million Coaches Challenge, an initiative that we at the Susan Crown Exchange were so grateful to be a part of and support over the last 4 years. Million Coaches was a nationwide effort of 18 organizations who banded together and collectively trained more than 1 million coaches in youth development and mental health. Million Coaches was designed to fill a gap and uplift the power of coaches. And as part of that collective action, the group also formed a collective voice, releasing calls to action for systems-level changes in youth sport to better support coaches, to begin breaking down the systemic barriers that exist. Many of those calls to action focused on policy and oversight. And yet, while coaches were the entry point for the Million Coaches Challenge and the organizations who were a part of it, there's quickly a realization that coaches operate in this fragmented and unregulated youth sports system. And to solve for coaching, we must also grapple with the fuller system. So to explore that, we've partnered with leaders from across youth sports who engage in this three-part webinar series. Webinar 1 today will lay the groundwork for understanding our current youth sports model, provide comparisons to other countries, and examine the landscape of safety, quality, and access for youth today. Next month, in May, we'll host the second webinar, and this will look at successful policy movements from other sectors from which the youth sports movement can learn. We'll take a deep dive into childcare, smoking prevention, school wellness, and after-school programming. And in June, we'll host the third part, a webinar that will provide an overview of current youth sport policy work at the state level that can serve as building blocks for where we go next. And by the end of this series, by the end of these three parts, I hope that we all leave with a renewed sense of possibility. So today, I will be your host in moderating this conversation, and I'm honored to be joined by three esteemed speakers. Dionne Kohler, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Sport and the Law at the University of Baltimore. Dionne has also authored a book, More Than Play: How Law, Policy, and Politics Shape Youth Sport. Kesogalis is the Associate Professor and Program Director at Drexel University. He's also the President of the United States Center for Coaching Excellence. And Renata Simul, President and CEO of the LA84 Foundation and Play Equity Fund. Renata also serves on the California Governor's Advisory Council for Physical Fitness and Mental Wellbeing. Over the next hour, I will bring each speaker into the conversation individually to share about their perspective, and then the four of us will engage in a full group conversation. We'll save the last 15 minutes today for audience Q&A, which you can submit through the chat. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Dionne to join me on screen. Dionne is going to share her vast knowledge, personal and professional, on how we got here in the current state of the youth sports system. Dionne, it is good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. This is a really great event, and we really, really need it right now.
Well, I know you have been leading the conversation, Dionne, on sports governance and law through your role as a law professor, also as co-chair of the Commission on the Study of Olympics and Paralympics. You've authored More Than Play, and you are tying together so many different kind of sectors into understanding how we got where we are today. And so I'd like to give you a little bit of space here to share more. Can you tell us how law, policy, and politics have shaped youth sports as we currently know it?
Yeah, that's a really great question because I think as we approach all policy conversations around sports, I think it's really useful to have this kind of background. And that's what I wanted to get my arms around when I wrote the book. So the intersection of law, policy, and politics, I think, has both shaped youth sport by as much as what it says as what it does not say and do, right? So a big theme that I discuss in the book is that youth sport today is really the result of both some explicit policy choices, but mostly it's heavily shaped by kind of the absence of policy thought and policy coordination. So as I talk about in the book, it helps to understand how we got here by looking at legal history. And so if you look at where youth sport occurs as a kind of law and policy matter, the terrain is kind of the intersection of sports law and the law of the family and the child. And as a law and policy matter, these are areas that have been traditionally characterized as private spheres, with the assumption that the government should stay out of it, give deference to sports sponsors to do whatever they want with the games, and give deference to families. It used to be just husbands, but now it's families to raise their children how they see fit. And so viewing sport and viewing family and the raising of children as private matters meant that the result is generally very little regulation.
Thanks for kind of walking us through that history very briefly. And I know there's so much to unpack there and certainly much more in the book. And so I think you raise this idea that it's more defined by absence of policy. And so I wonder if you could share from your perspective, is it working or not working? What about the current design of our system is working for young people, and where do you still see opportunities? And we'll go from there.
Yeah. So first of all, I think we need more research to determine what is working and what is not working. We don't have a lot of that. We certainly have research, for instance, from the medical community that is talking about what's not working when we talk about overuse injuries and early sports specialization. But before we assess what is working and what is not working, I think it's important to step back and remember we don't have a system that has been designed. So what we're assessing is sort of this Wild West situation, right? And so we don't really have a system of oversight for sport generally in this country. Sport at all levels operates generally through principles of autonomy and monopoly. So there's no coordinating federal agency, the USOPC, the NCAA. These are private entities. They're not government actors. And so in terms of what is working, I think the answer to this really depends on what sport context you're talking about. If you were talking about professional sports, I would say the system works pretty well because professional sports are subject to labor law, for instance, that permits unionization. And so what we see as the sports product at the professional level is the result of athletes and sports sponsors getting together, hammering out a deal on what it's all going to be. When we talk about other levels of sport, and certainly youth sport, which is sort of at the bottom of the pecking order, we see there's struggle, there's some litigation, there's some scandal, there's some harms. We don't have this type of coordination. And so when we talk about sports for children, we assume that parents will take care of their children the way, say, a union takes care of professional athletes in professional sports. And what we do know is that that's unrealistic. It, for the most part, despite parents' very best intentions, it mostly can't happen and doesn't happen. So in terms of kind of where sport is positioned and what we know works well and doesn't work well, we also see that injected into policy conversations about what is working and what isn't working is something that I've written about that I call the sports apocalypse argument, which is every time we put on the table, hey, let's have a conversation about whether youth sport is working or whether college sports is working, right? What we see is pushback in the form of, hey, if we do anything here to regulate or change the status quo, it's going to destroy the whole enterprise. We're going to blow it all up. And so we see that in a lot of court opinions. We see that in a lot of policy discussions. And so what I would say, Kevin, is we need a lot more work to do to assess what's working and not working in youth sports. And we need to get rid of that noise, that sports apocalypsing, that stop touching any of this, because we know that there's good work that can be done.
Yeah, I love that phrase that you're coining here. And I would say for folks who are interested in kind of diving in more of that and how we might be able to overcome that complex, like join in next month with this second webinar series where I think what you're describing in sport apocalypse, that is a natural, almost expected part of the policy evolution. And it's something that these other sectors also had to grapple with. So I appreciate you kind of bringing us to that point. And you also named this current moment where it does feel like the Wild Wild West. It is in many ways because we don't have that central body. And as a parent kind of navigating this area right now with 3 young kids, you certainly feel like you're on an island without a lead agency or anyone really being positioned to have the authority to act as a lead agency. How problematic has that been? And do you see promise or a role for such an agency, whether it's at the state level or the federal level? And also noting for the different contexts, right? School-based sports, recreational sports, elite sports. I wonder if you could share a little bit more on how this lack of an agency is impacting our experience today.
Well, I'll give you one example, Kevin. That's we could do a whole webinar just on that alone. And so I think what you talked about in your question is really an important point here. The space around sports for children, as I talk about in my book, the first chapter is about let's even define what youth sport is. What do we even mean this is? So if we're going to research, if we're going to collect data, what is it? And guess what? When I started looking for definitions in different laws, different legal definitions, there's a lot of different definitions of youth sport. And so what you get is you get different policy approaches. High school sports is regulated differently than private youth sports, than sports that are covered by an NGB. What the splintering of this space has meant, I think, unfortunately, what we've seen, kind of worst case scenario is, for instance, no central coordinating body to track abusers who move through sports, for instance. So, if they're popping around in different contexts, we're not catching that. The U.S. Center for Safe Sport does not have jurisdiction over all youth sport in the United States. It's something we made a policy recommendation to Congress about, is saying parents think that there's some body out there making sure that all their kids are safe. That only applies to the Olympic and Paralympic movement. So I think the splintering is something where there's a lot of policy space where we can do some common sense regulation. We can pull together some coordinating threads and make things safer for kids. But the splintering can be both beneficial. We like how high school sports might run, but it can also be a real negative when we talk about, say, folks that are bad actors who can kind of travel through different sports contexts and reach children that way.
I appreciate you raising that. There's essential building blocks maybe that are missing from the system right now, just including shared definitions from which we almost have to align on first in order to really pursue, any type of scalable or widespread policy. So thanks for drawing a line under that. I know you're going to join us a little later on in this conversation, and we'll dive more into it. But I encourage anyone to follow up and check out Dionne's book and her work to get a very nuanced and in-depth look into this space. So Dionne, thank you again. I'm going to invite Cam to join us now to share a bit about the international perspective. As we were discussing with Dionne just a moment ago, right, in the United States, we may not have that lead agency. We may have a fairly fragmented system, but that is not the only way it has to be designed. There are examples elsewhere around the world. And Cam, I know you're bringing a rich personal and professional experience both here and abroad. You've been operating in the coaching space and the governance space for quite some time. So thank you for joining us. It's also great to see you, and appreciate your time today.
And you, Kevin, and really appreciate the opportunity to have a robust conversation about a topic that I know our panelists are very passionate about, but I also know that with the conversations we have with coaches, with parents, and the youngsters that are involved with sport across our fine nation, there's a lot of opinions, and so I'm keen to turn some discussion into action because I know there's a lot of great stuff going on.
That is the spirit that I think we are all here for, Cam. And I think drawing on those experiences from abroad, I know, you of course have spent quite a bit of time in the Australian system, right? As a teacher, as a coach, part of that movement, and here in the US as part of the US OPC movement. I've always sensed from you like that this is possible. And what we do need is less talk and more action. So I'm excited to engage in these next 10 minutes of conversation. Given Dionne's discussion of the American system, or lack thereof, what is a country that has a system of governance that reflects the way in which a well-developed youth policy can operate? Canada, Australia, UK, there are examples. And is there any one or two that really stick out to you as having a fairly comprehensive and effective system?
Sure. Well, I think you touched on it in the intro with Norway and their success at the most recent Winter Games. But I think just scaling back just for a moment, why would we want to look abroad when we've got so many assets, so many opportunities? And I do think there's some value there. I think how we value youth sport, particularly. Dionne mentioned that there's a sense of commoditization. But a country like Norway certainly looks at sport more as a public good, and how that's connected with youth development, with well-being, and with performance. I think is a really critical attribute of let's say the Norwegian system. It's sport is seen as a social right, not so much as a commodity, and that there's alignment. I think that's probably the one real strength in a smaller nation, of course, like Norway, is that there's alignment between the federations, the clubs, and particularly the coaches. And that for me is where, I've a lifelong passion, not only at the youth sport level, but all the way through to now being a lifelong participant in sport myself, really thinking about the alignment of all the activities. And we live in a large country, and there's a lot of complicated elements that are reflected not just in sport. So how can we learn from others but adapt to not only our strengths, but looking for opportunities to grow that and become more aligned? Because I think Norway as a starting point is a great one. I think New Zealand is another one. And as Australian, it's sometimes a little hard to acknowledge the neighbours to the other side over there with New Zealand. But they also do a super job, I think, with prioritising coaching. And really articulating what quality looks like, quality coaching. And that there's a developmental pathway along the way that really is well articulated, and again is well aligned with not only teaching principles but also the application of sport beyond just the playing field. So I think those two as a starting point. Smaller nations, of course, but per capita do an excellent job and really can give us some shape around the interconnected nature of the ecosystem of youth sport, but also the important nature of support, not just from the top down, but across the sports system.
I want to touch on the connection between the system and coaching, because I know you can draw a line there. But first, just for those of us who maybe are inspired by these examples from abroad, but aren't as familiar actually with what that system looks like, can you give a quick description? Who are those key stakeholders or actors? Like in New Zealand, for example, we say they have a more evolved system. What does that mean? Is that the government has an arm? Is there a nonprofit body that's been, positioned to act in that regard? Can you name a couple of those key actors and just how that system is designed and what they are responsible for?
Sure. I mean, so often the starting point is some form of sport ministry, some kind of oversight body that all these roads lead through. And I think that's one element that we've talked a lot about stateside. but what that looks like, not just from a top-down perspective, but to create alignment and to provide resources. I think that particularly from a Norway and New Zealand perspective, that sport ministry component is an important one. I think another example worth bringing up, particularly around coaching, is our neighbours to the north, in fact, to Canada, because I think the combination between the thinking around long-term athlete development, but also where the coach fits in that conversation, and particularly around certification, is really important. And that the Canadians do a really nice job with their coaching coalition of bringing their coaches together, and setting standards and having conversations and policy around what does quality coaching look like. Now, are there downsides? For sure. With additional entities, additional organizations, there's the risk of complexity and over governance. And that's one of the things that I grew up with in Australia, and I know the complexity around layers of government, layers of organization can sometimes inhibit the freedom that we see, is in some respects a real strength, that what may work for one sport at one level may be very different at other levels.
Thanks for sharing those examples, specifically the way it could show up for coaches. And kind of leads me to this last question in these last 2 minutes together, about impact, right? So the system maybe enables some of these inputs or opportunities to convene coaches, to develop shared standards, which I think many of us have recognized as existing gaps here in the US. But then the second question is, that it actually leads to better coaching or more confident coaches or coaches who stay in the profession for longer. What's your sense of actual impact from these other models where a system actually made a concerted and coordinated effort to uplift coaches?
Sure. I think specifically to coach development systems, the idea that many countries around the world, whether it be those down in Brazil over to those in Japan, of moving beyond the traditional lecture or certification models of coach education to thinking more about really essentially the principles around adult development, learning on the job, experiential learning, coaches becoming more self-directed, and thinking about coaching not as an overnight, I've done my certification, now I'm a coach, and before I wasn't, but really thinking about the long-term development, not of just of our athletes, but of coaches and the systems within those coaches operate in, and that we genuinely need to move beyond the idea of that person will figure it out just because they played the sport or operated at a certain level. Coaching is an evolving process, and that if there's one attribute that I think we can do a better job is thinking about the life cycle of coaches, not just the identification of coaches, but how do we develop them? How do we retain them? And probably the biggest one that we don't do very well is the retirement, the transition, because that lifelong knowledge of those coaches that have learned from their mistakes, they're knowledge stewards, that with that they can pass on so much, not just through mentorship, but really providing the checks and balances that we need to ensure that we're developing and growing, not just going back to square one and re-establishing the same lessons and the same patterns over and over again.
Absolutely. Well, as the research continues to articulate just the impact of coaches on a young person's development, having that outsized impact, being that mentor and that trusted adult, we know that these systems are critically important. Right? It's about the resources available to them. It's about the structures of support that are available to coaches. It's about the culture that we have. And so in some ways, what I'm hearing, these other countries, Canada, Norway, New Zealand, they're also indicating to the general public and the youth sports sector that this is critical. Like, we're putting resources and time behind it because we know that coaches matter for a young person's development off the field and on the field. I think in those countries. We'll dive in a little bit more in just a few minutes, and just want to thank you for sharing some quick insights from across the globe, Cam.
Thanks.
All right, now as Cam jumps off, Renata will come back and join. Here I am. Hey,
Here
Renata.
you are. Hey, Kevin.
The beauty of technology, right?
You know, here we are.
You're adaptable. I used to be a teacher. They said, come with a backup plan, right? If the tech fails, make sure you have a backup plan. And I'd be thinking, I have a 90-minute class to teach. I can't plan two 90-minute classes, one tech,
Right.
one tech. But it is. Renata, it's such a pleasure to have you here. And we've had a chance to work together for a number of years, and you've always been in awe of the work you're leading both nationally and in California. You sit in so many different seats in the center of so many conversations. And so excited to have you here to share a bit about what's been evolving in California over a number of years, but perhaps hitting some really critical milestones as well. And so I want to touch on kind of like two sides of the work that I view in California. There are some very immediate initiatives to help kind of support coaches today and tomorrow. And then there are those big systems changing levers that are being pulled and explored through some of the work you've been a part of through the Play Equity Fund and different bills moving through legislation. But I want to start with the near term. Last year, or in 2024, the Governor's Council on mental health and physical fitness partnered with the Million Coaches Challenge to launch the California Coaching Challenge, right? This goal to train 1 million or 25,000 coaches across California. Can you share a little background like how that came to be, its impact in the state, and where it fits in the longer term strategy for building out a more equitable youth sports system there?
Yeah, certainly. First, let me say thanks to you and to the Susan Crown Exchange for the Million Coaches Challenge and for hosting this webinar. I literally have 4 pages of notes just listening to Cam and Dionne, so it's a pleasure to share the virtual stage with both of them. We hosted our big summit last week, and it was titled Beyond Spectacle, Play Because It Matters. And, coming out of that summit, it was very clear to me that youth sports has not been treated like an afterthought. As has been said by, I think, Dionne and Cam, that it's been treated like a marketplace, a performance vehicle, a privileged good, rather than a public good. So I really appreciate Cam lifting that up. And we all know that when that happens, access follows income, quality follows geography, and too many kids are left out, priced out, or pushed out of the system. And I think it helps to set the context of the Governor's Council and the Millions Coaches Challenge is, most people might know that I run the foundation, which is a legacy of the 84 games. And we have always invested directly in kids, in coaches, and in community organizations. But with Play Equity Fund, we wanted to go upstream because we realized that the conditions were systemic. And for us to have any meaningful change as a legacy of an Olympic Games, that we really had to address both direct service and system change. And our formula has been pretty simple: research and data to make inequities visible, coalition and partnerships to help organize around shared solutions, narrative and storytelling to elevate youth as a public good, as Cam mentioned, right? The value of what we know sports does, and then advocacy to turn that into policy change. And we've approached it in California not as a one-off and not as a single bill, but as a long-term strategy to address access, coordination, resources, and coaching together. So on the question of California's commitment, it was simply one of an opportunity to align and to partner. Susan Crown Exchange and the 18 coaching organizations you work with really set the model. And in the green room, as it were, Dionne and I were talking, is so goes California, so goes the nation, right? The 4th largest economy in the world. I said, let's use this opportunity to support what the Susan Crown Exchange was doing. Both the governor and the first partner are very animated about youth sports and play, and the first partner is particularly just moved about coaching from our own experience and their 4 kids who are in the youth sports system. And so we simply help coordinate your efforts, the organization's effort in California. The first partner in the council, loved the opportunity. And then it was certainly the partnership with Positive Coaching Alliance and the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport, who created that shared curriculum. And then we're able to be a boots on the ground to not just meet, but to exceed, our coaching challenge in California. I think we put on the board 25,000 coaches, and we trained 30,000 coaches. And so really helping to, translate vision into action. And so it was true collaboration and partnership.
It really was. Just saying from my seat, what really struck me were how many different partners were involved. You had the advisory council, you had PCA, the Center for Healing and Justice, and then coaches there as a support. But when it came to actually who you were training, it wasn't just the three largest institutions in California and 25,000. It was hundreds of organizations who were calling for these resources for their coaches. And it was a really interesting insight into demand and need that exists throughout all pockets of the state. And so that was a really exciting development and milestone for you all, while also in the background for years, you've been building towards these systemic levers. And I was wondering if you could share just a little bit about the systemic work and some of these bills that are moving through California legislature that start to explore the role that the state may have on a broader level when it comes to youth sport.
Yeah, the Governor's Council, was the first partner, and the governor's expression of how do we coordinate efforts, but they don't have any legislative teeth. And so, really being able to use national initiatives like the Million Coaches Challenge really gave us a platform for storytelling. We all know that coaches are most important touch point. Many aren't, trained in the mental health and mental wellness, meeting kids where they are. We know all of those things. And so for us at the Play Equity Fund in particular, we saw it as an opportunity to, what do we call it? Jump onto your wagon, so to speak, so that we had something to share the value of what we were doing. But more importantly is to show that there, as has been said by our previous two panelists, there is no coordinated system. It was mentioned that we're one of the few industrialized countries that don't have a youth sports commission. I encourage those who haven't picked up Dionne's book to pick it up. I'm a third of the way through, and it really sets the context and the framing. So we had been doing systemic work at the local level with resources at the county level, with reducing fees at community colleges for access. Recess bill at the state was our first, sort of entry into the state. But I think it's important to note the process that we took was research. And we had done a youth sports survey at LA County, who plays, who doesn't play, what sports, et cetera. And Fernando Ramirez, who joined the team a few years ago, has a political background at all levels within the state. And he suggested that we do a statewide survey, but we do it from a voter's perspective, right? A political survey that does all of the things that we had done in terms of the sample size and who's playing and who's not playing, but really tap into voter sentiment around sport play movement, coaching, inequities, et cetera. And then we use that to drive a suggested policy relief. And then we did briefings with legislators. And one legislator, Tina McKenna, we had two. I think, really if we want to move the needle is the school system and bringing play back. I wouldn't say bringing play back into school, but actually reimagining play in school to be about all that we know that's important for youth development. So we had those two options to study the creation of a youth sports department or commission or education. We left that to the side, and she was interested in authoring a bill. It was our first, statewide bill that we co-sponsored, and the governor signed it in November. And now we're waiting for the May revise to bring a panel of experts together to really look at and study and use California as a platform for work that's been happening across the country, in Chicago, at the state level, and coalitions across the U.S. to really try to use this as a rallying cry, a red herring of what can be done around coordinating resources, safety, coaching, education, and programmatic quality in the state of California.
Thanks for sharing a bit about that commission bill, which has the potential to really have this wrap around comprehensive look into sports in California. And I know there's others moving, AB 1626 around mental health training for coaches. And so there's very targeted approaches, it seems, that are being pursued. And then these comprehensive looks. I think the commission is a good segue into the full group conversation. So I want to take a moment to welcome Cam and Dionne back onto the screen. And we have about 10 to 15 minutes to engage as a group. But Renata, I'd love to kind of step into where you were just leaving off with the commission in California and what it might represent or enable in other places across the country. And so this is a big question. We don't have the agency. How should the U.S. get started in building a more comprehensive system? And then related, is there a role for the federal goal? Is this a state's issue? Does it need to start at the states? I'd love just like kind of your input, and you started talking about the theory of change there for what California can do for others. Maybe you can elaborate on that piece.
Yeah, that's such a complicated question. I think Cam said it best. And play equity, when I created put the two words together, is not just about elevating the inequities in youth sports, but it's really about the value of youth sports. My husband's in the private equity business, right? So when you say private equity, there's value there. And so I think narrative and storytelling and the work that the Million Coaches Challenges is doing, Dionne's book, the work that Cam's doing, the work the Project Play is doing, and so many organizations across this country, I do believe legislators are paying attention. If you've been following Cory Booker, he's animated. So I think the solution starts in keeping this momentum going. We have the Olympic and Paralympic Games coming to Los Angeles in 2028. We have the Winter Paralympic and Olympic Games coming to Utah in 2032. These are once in a generational opportunities to ask the question, how do we do both and? How do we celebrate Olympic and Paralympic athletes on the podium, but also invest in the grassroots system? So I think that there is a responsibility and work that can be done at all levels, and it is being done at all levels. The grassroots level, the county level, with regional coalitions. Nike just announced the MOVE Fund, thanks to Susan Crown Exchange for investing in that to help build capacity at the grassroots level. Because I have a government background. And I know one thing about government: they will not move unless the voters tell them to move. And so everyone that's on this call, everyone that's in the movement, needs to continue to be very loud about the value of sports and the fact that we don't need to tinker around and rebuild a system that was never designed to support the grassroots system, that we need to build a new system to do better by the youth of all the children of America.
Cam, what does that raise for you? What about that inspires you? Where do you get started? I heard pieces from each of you in our conversation, like, oh, we need shared definitions. We can start with the research, maybe start with voters, right? And like where their perspectives are coming in from. Cam, where do you get started if we want to build a more comprehensive system here?
Yeah, look, I just want to mention the Play Equity event last week up in LA, because I was inspired. I walked away and I really thought that the idea of a spectacle is coming into every sport that we're involved with at every level. And so it's an everybody problem. Where's the beginning of a circle? Well, we jump in, and I what I love about this conversation is maybe not where do we start, but what's next. Whose shoulder we tap on, like our shoulders were tapped on by someone to say, hey, why don't you think about a leadership role, getting into coaching, staying more involved with the sport, playing to people's strengths? Because, yeah, I mean, the easy answer is a top-down thing, but it's way more complicated than that. We all need to be doing more. And particularly, I think particularly those that don't have a leadership role in title, but to know that they can impact, we can all impact change. And that's the one thing that I hope those that are on the call walk away from our message, is that we all have a role and a part to play in this, because it's not if it was a simple fix, it would have been done already. It's not just about more money. It's not more about another organization. It's not about something very simple. It's complicated, and we all, if I could make it as simple as possible, we all need to come together in conversations like this, but take action. And I know that's what Renata and Dionne are doing. I know that's what you guys are doing at Susan Crown. I know that Project Play is doing it. We're doing it at the USCCE. We have to pick our lane and stay in our lane and continue to work together to build this thing. And it's not starting from scratch. I think that's maybe the biggest mistake if we go backwards. We need to be looking forward, and like we do on the field of play, be where we are now, not look backwards at what just happened, but try and anticipate, how do we prepare for the next Olympics? How do we think even further ahead for the Winter Olympics that we'll be hosting in 34? And really think about, how do we bring more people into this space so that we build stronger systems and that are less fragmented and more coherent?
Kevin, can I give just one practical example? I got excited and forgot. Is I think picking up work that's momentum. So we took the Million Coaches Challenge, the 25 by 25 in California. We've taken that same curriculum we're managing the legacy for the World Cup in Los Angeles in partnership with the host committee. We've actually trained the coaches with that curriculum that has youth development and the skills and drills. And we're now working with Cal South, which is the coaching body here in Los Angeles, Southern California, and the U.S. Soccer Federation to create new coaching standards that include youth development. And we're working with the coaches because they're saying, well, it might be 3 to 5 years. And we're like, we don't have 3 to 5 years to wait. And so creating that momentum and that advocacy from the coaches themselves who all benefit from it is, I think, practical, real life examples that, I just want to lift up listening to Cam, is that taking what we see at the national level, bringing it down to the grassroots level that goes back up to the governing body, that quite frankly, other NGBs can follow suit. And I know USA Hockey is already doing some great work in that regard.
It's a really interesting example that you share, Renata. It reminds you, like, we all can't operate in silos here, right? You can have grassroots and local level systems change and policies, state level, federal level, and we need that long-term view on it. But mostly what we need is this sense of complement among everyone and a shared agenda and vision for what that looks like. And so I appreciate that example to say how it's actually rolling out today. Dionne, would you share anything here? Like, I appreciate Cam's note around action. Where would you get started for someone who's feeling ready to go? What's your recommendation?
Well, first of all, these are policy conversations that we've never had around youth sports. So this is a very, very exciting time. As I said before, we don't have a system. We don't have coordination. So where do you start to get that? You start with these conversations. The other thing I would remind people of, and I've said this before, but I think it really bears repeating, is that we know policy matters in society generally. Policy gets a really bad rap if you just kind of listen to the political nonsense that goes on day in and day out. But we breathe clean air, we drink clean water, we mostly, we have an aviation system, we have safe bank accounts, all kinds of stuff that we take for granted in the United States is the result of public policy. And if we look at sports as well, look at the important policy interventions that have made a critical difference. Title IX, right? Mm-hmm. That is opening up sport to girls and women. That was something that was considered to be impossible, that again would destroy all of sports. Sport has never been better. So there's all these kind of great examples in sports and in society generally where policy makes a difference. And I would say, I think we need to hold on to that. Because what we're going to be told as we work towards change in youth sport is, hey, that's impossible and we can't do that and we can't make that happen. And I can tell you, I wrote a whole book about this is impossible, that is impossible. And now it's just the way things are, right? The final thing I'd say that folks should think about is lead with the idea that what we are talking about is kids, not sports. Don't lead with the idea of sports. Sport is important. We all love sports. We know all the good things that can happen from sports. But ultimately, we are talking about children and a product that is given to children. And that's why I think the solutions have to be shared between the federal government and the states, because I don't think a child in California should be safer in sports than a child in Mississippi or Texas or anywhere else. And so there's really room in our unique federal system for that shared federal sort of national and state solutions. But I think when we do those solutions, we should never forget, let's stop talking about sports because we tend to lose our way, especially when we make policy choices. Let's talk about kids.
That's such a great point.
Framing feels so essential here. And how you talk to constituents, the policymakers, the parents. And so I really appreciate that point. And Title IX is a really important example to say, like, what we can do. And we're decades into it and we see the impact. The other area of policy in youth sport right now that's really kind of made movement is around safety. It's driven many of the policies enacted to govern youth sports, the creation of the Center for Safe Sport, AED requirements. When I was high school coaching, CPR and concussion training were the requirements. In your view, as a panel here, how effective have these been, and how has this current focus around safety either helped or hindered the ability to now move into more comprehensive conversations?
I'm
I'm
happy
looking
to
at Cam.
start, Kevin. I'm sorry. I'm happy to start. There is quite a bit of public health research on youth sport concussion legislation. All 50 states have some form of youth sport concussion legislation that have kind of the same three core elements. The NCAA, the NFL really lobbied hard for these. I've made the argument that on the one hand, these statutes are great because they put youth sport concussions into a conversation that nobody was having, and that can generate awareness. On the other hand, the devil's in the details. And so studies have shown that these laws really aren't that effective in terms of a remedy. We got lots of kids getting concussions, lots of kids not being pulled out of sports when they should. And so the way the statutes are written, they're not really enforceable. And so without teeth, something like that really doesn't work. On the other hand, I'm here in Maryland where we have the Jordan McNair Safe and Fair Play Act heat guidelines, right? There's a very strict standard to make sure people are safe when they're practicing in weather that could be too hot. Something like that creates awareness that can create real change. So I think it's a mixed bag. If you look at all these different little one-off state laws that we have, and again, without national standards and without teeth, it's a great start in a right direction, but for the most part, not really creating the type of change I think many of us would like to see.
I would echo that, Kevin, and I'd also, for fear of stating the obvious, is that the vast majority of coaches in the youth sports systems are volunteers. We're asking them to do a lot. Their mothers, their fathers, their sister, brothers, aunties, full-time jobs, and really, doing this for heart. Many that we find, and I know you find, are parent coaches as well, right? Their kids are playing, and so they're trying to help out. And so I just echo Dionne's comments, is that we've made some progress in understanding the health risks. There has been some legislation, but I think reform is still needed to really support coaches. And what we see in underserved communities is good luck if you have a trainer, on the field, to be able to deal with concussion protocols as one example. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'd follow up because I think the Center for Safe Sport has is another example of we could be very critical of the things they could be doing and more they ought to be doing. But I think for the to put our athletes, and particularly our youngest athletes, at the center of this conversation, as Dionne said earlier, how do we help support our coaches do a better job? Whether they're brand new into the role or they've been doing it for 30 years. Some of our biggest concerns are coaches that have been doing the same job year in, year out and not developing and not growing. So the safe sport training, in our experience, we're hearing people now have conversations about bullying and abuse and the way we talk to each other and the way we treat each other in a very different way. And I would say there's a link. I don't know how closely we could articulate that link, but because we're all having to go through safe sport training, we're having conversations about how do we treat each other as human beings in a better way, not just athlete to athlete or coach to athlete, but everybody involved in the sport, from the volunteers that open the gates to the parking lot, all the way through to the concession people that feed us on a Saturday afternoon watching, whatever activity we're attending. So I think the ongoing development of how do we do a better job at every level, because again, it's not a simple quick fix of throw a bunch of money at it, throw another organization, and everything's going to get better. It does require, I believe, a shift in the mindset, a shift in the culture to how do we all look after each other so that when there is another organization or when there are more resources, that we're moving in the right direction.
There's so much more here than just the policy itself. And Dionne, you underscored that, each of you did. Even if we draft up the policy, it has support from different stakeholders and it feels right for the moment. If we haven't thought through implementation or enforceability or how we're communicating that to our audience and our communities, we often find those falling flat. So thank you for sharing those insights. In these last 10 minutes, we have a few questions that have come in from the audience. So I'd like to share these with the group. The first is a question around the cost of adding new regulations. And so particularly as you keep adding requirements to programs and coaches and voice concerns about cost, who's paying for the coaches? Who's paying for the coaches for their time to get the education and the certifications? Won't that require increased costs? How are you bringing in or incentivizing commercial partners to help bring those costs down. This has come up so often with the Million Coaches community and so many other spaces. How do we contend with this issue that more regulation, more training often comes with more costs?
Yeah,
I think an
we need to
important, sorry, go ahead, Cam. So, this always comes up, and what I say is that good policy can be expensive. That doesn't necessarily make it bad policy, right? The argument about Title IX and bringing women and girls into sports was it's too expensive. We just can't do it. We can't give these folks programs. So again, I think we need to keep history in mind and decide what our priorities are. That's what the policy process is for. In terms of where money can come from, well, the sports betting industry is going gangbusters. It's very problematic, lots of ethical issues there. But to the extent revenue is being generated, should we be telling our federal and state legislators, hey, let's put a real portion of this towards coaches and coach training? We have an Olympic and Paralympic movement that generates revenue. We have lots of different sources. There's plenty of money in sports, Kevin. And so the question is, how are we allocating that money? And you have to put it forward as an agenda item. And the professionalization of coaches is something that is entirely achievable in this country. We have world-class sports infrastructure and sports programs in our colleges and universities. We can teach people how to work with kids effectively in sports. And so there's lots of ways that we can fund it. If we just describe it, make it a discrete policy issue, and then start putting out the solutions that work best in our states.
I'll be a little bit more brief on this one, Kevin. We all say coaching is important, but where do we allocate the resources? And so often it's part of multiple roles that someone has to play. And we say it's important, but we have to match the prioritization with the resource allocation. Incentives, recognition, that's really important. But if we don't, as a community, and it's not just one organization, I know a lot of people will point at organizations like the USOPC or the NCAA. They've got so many complex challenges that they're dealing with. Again, it's not just a simple fix. But if we can all be working together to say, if this is a priority of preparing, training, and developing coaches, not just putting them through a course, but really looking at their long-term development, then it is a scaffolded approach. It's not just throw a bunch of money to get an undergraduate degree or a master's degree. It is an ongoing process of where are the areas of expertise that need to be developed and really being thoughtful. And I think USA Hockey do a really good job of thinking about where do we place our coach developers in the field.
Right.
I think that is a concrete example of where are the people that we can all go reach out to and say, hey, Renata, can you help me with this? Hey, Dionne, I need some help with that. Because I think that's the community building that makes what is the envy of the rest of the world. We look at the US from outside and go, oh my God, it's incredible. It's incredibly complicated, but the community orientation is a strength that I think sometimes we underplay.
Kevin, I would just add, there's examples and ideas out there, and yes, it's a resource redistribution issue, not a resource issue. I believe we have the resources to solve this problem. I think it gets back to priorities. At the beginning of I think maybe it was a conversation with Cam about international models. The one thing that, I've learned from learning about these international models and traveling the world is that they place Norway, New Zealand, UK, Paris, they place value on youth development through sports. In this country, we have always treated it like a marketplace. We have always treated it like a performance vehicle, and we have always treated it like a public good. And so if the folks watching this webinar take anything away, is that it's going to take systemic policy reforms, not to tinker around with the system, but to really build new systems within our schools and new systems at the state and federal level that prioritize kids first and builds a system that helps to develop youth, coaches, and anybody and everybody involved in the system, so that we hopefully beat Norway at one of these Olympic Games.
What I might add, and this is kind of a through line through each of yours, is it's also baked into the American mindset that we will pay for the things that we value, whether that is as a parent or as an organization or government, whoever is the payer, we pay for the things that we value. And so much of this is about ensuring that it's not just us, Cam, and those in the audience today who believe that coaches are important, but it's the people who are actually going to be the decision makers, the folks who have to allocate those existing dollars also believe that as well. And so that's one piece of this larger puzzle. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'd like to ask one final question, maybe get a quick response from each of you. And Cam, I'm going to start with you on this one. It's an international question. How are other countries like Canada and Australia approaching the preparation of early youth coaches, particularly around ensuring they're not the win at all cost coaches? We've seen that train get out of the station. We know that's a growing issue for many communities and parents. How are you seeing other countries approach that?
Yeah, it's before they get the whistle and the clipboard in the hands. It's when they get onto the field. Have they got other backgrounds in the classroom? And we see it. We see these early stages of leadership on the field. How do we help nurture that before they get into the coaching role? And there are systematized and formal structures of athlete to coach transition programs all over the world. We're doing it at the USOPC. They're in existence, but coaches learn on the field of play. It's not in the classroom. Yes, it is a pathway, but that process of how do we identify, how do we develop those skills, how do we recognize them early and nurture them along the way? Again, it's not a quick fix. So I think that, from Australia to our friends in Great Britain, fabulous systems in place, but it's not that there are multiple entry points. And I think that's the critical element of not just one way to develop individuals to become coaches in the future.
Kevin, I just joined the advisory board of a pay-to-play club that's doing it differently. And I worked at the Dodgers, as many know, and had the tremendous pleasure of knowing and working alongside Tommy Lasorda. And Warren Lichtenstein, who runs what's called Steel Sports, actually has a coaching philosophy that's kids first. So he embeds it in kids first philosophy and what Tommy Lasorda stood for in terms of bringing out the best in the player as a character, not necessarily winning. And I think that we can see that when you apply a kids first mentality, character development, and all the things, for those of you who know Tommy Lasorda and what he stood for, that it shows that also is a winning mentality. And so I would just point the audience to Steel Sports and their coaching model that is driving real change in communities across the Midwest.
Thanks for raising those exemplars. Dionne, anything to add briefly in this last minute?
Yeah, the last minute is this. I would say beware the sports apocalypse argument. When everybody goes out and starts trying to fight for change, you're going to see it. It's everywhere. Do not be deterred. Do not be fooled. Do not stop fighting for kids.
That is such a strong sentiment to end on. As I mentioned early in those introductory remarks, my goal was to feel a sense of possibility. Today, I heard actionable steps, exemplars that exist, other countries to draw from. And next month, we'll be diving into other sectors that we can draw from. So thank you to the three of you for joining us today, for everyone who watched and participated and submitted questions through the chat. Next month on May 14th, we will be hosting the second part of this webinar series where we will look at successful policy movements from other sectors in the United States, including childcare, smoking prevention, after school and school wellness. As someone who came from the K-12 education space, I'm very excited to hear what lessons we can draw from each of those. And the last note I will leave us on is something that Cam said during his remarks earlier in this conversation. Maybe the question is not where do I start? It is what is next. So with that sentiment, I want to thank you all once more and look forward to staying in touch.